Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm confused too, because this is quite a confusing topic. It's a big topic, but it's a wonderful topic. And thank you very much for the invitation to come and join you here at this research project and this conference that's taking place. I like to be, I'm a fairly visual person, so I'm going to speak to a PowerPoint and not to paper. And the good thing about the lights going down is if you want to go to sleep, you can go to sleep. I won't notice.
Yes, it's good.
That's good. Thanks, Fabian. Yes, good. Yes, so thinking about the concept of person in Islam, it was interesting to listen to the earlier talks on Judaism and on Christianity, because I'm tempted to cross-fertilise. I heard many things there that I thought that's a hook. That would be very interesting to cross-fertilise about. I won't do it in this paper, but perhaps we could do it in discussion time or tomorrow morning in the discussion that we have. Now, in my paper, I'm going to look at Islamic scholarship. I'm going to look at Islamic textual materials. I'm also going to think about Muslim people, ordinary Muslim people, how they understand the notion of person, and how that's informed by the texts and by scholarship. Now, it's interesting, just beginning with Muslim people for a moment, it's interesting when you think about how Muslim people understand their faith. Muslims are given a system, really, to understand their faith, and it's based on a set of beliefs and a set of practices. So Muslims are required to believe these are the core articles of faith: belief in Allah, belief in angels, belief in books, belief in prophets, belief in a day of judgment, and belief in the decrees of God. So they're the beliefs that Muslim peoples must hold. And then there are the practices that they are expected to follow. So pronouncing the creed, saying prayers, paying charity, fasting, pilgrimage, and some schools add on jihad and they debate what that means. So these are expectations on Muslim people to live out their faith. But what's missing there is a belief about Muslim people, a belief about a person. So nowhere there does it say, well, Muslims should believe about the person that they are, what it means to be human. Now, I think that will become clear as we go through the materials. And that's what I want to turn our attention to, because at the end of the day, humankind is not specified in the core beliefs and the rituals, as we saw, but the concept of humans is foundational because the beliefs are what people must hold to and the rituals are what people must perform. So, what is the Islamic understanding of the person? Let me begin by talking a little bit about terminology. As we heard from Professor Alam earlier, he looked at terminology. I'd like to do the same for the beginning. Now, this is a work in progress because I still have some work to do here. I've looked at terminology in the Qur'an. I haven't yet looked at the Hadith, so I will do more of that. But from what I've looked at so far, we're looking at three terms that appear in the Qur'an to express the concept of person. An-nas, plural of insan, nafs, anfus, or rajul, rijal. They're the terms that we see. Let's begin with the first one, an-nas. Well, an-nas, we find it appearing, for example, on the right-hand side in Surah 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 224, which says, "And make not Allah's name an excuse in your oaths against doing good or acting rightly, or making peace between persons, an-nas, for Allah is one who heareth and knoweth all things." And in that context, the concept of an-nas is being used as a kind of collective noun, namely the concept of people as a collective. And it's cognate with ish or anashim in in Hebrew. So that's the first term. The next term, which is the much more common term to to transmit the concept of person in the Quran is nafs. And this verse gives us a clear distinction between nafs and nas, which we just looked at. So Surah 5, verse 32 says, "On that account we ordained for the children of Israel that if anyone slew a person, a single person, nafsan, unless it be for murder or for spreading mischief in the land, it would be as if he slew the whole people, a nas. And if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of the whole people, a nas. Then, although there came to them our apostles with clear signs, yet even after that many of them continued to commit excesses in the land." So we have that clear distinction. It's a very helpful verse there. Very, very famous verse, often quoted, by the way. So when we think about the distinction there, we have this idea that nafs is an individual soul, a living person, it's cognate with the Hebrew nefesh, and a nas and nafs are variously translated as person. The former generic, a nas is the generic collective idea, mankind. The latter more specifically the individual self. Sometimes nafs, nefesh in Hebrew, nafs in Arabic, some verses use nafs to refer specifically to the physical person. So in 1254, the king said, this is from Surah Yusuf, of course, where Yusuf is speaking to the king. Pharaoh said, "Bring him to me, I will have him serve me personally, nafsi." And of course, nafs it also includes this inner idea of soul as well. So Surah 6, Ayah 93, who could be more wicked than someone who invents a lie against God? If you could only see the wicked in their death agonies as the angels stretch out their hands to them saying, "Give up your souls, anfusakum." Interestingly, on 6 occasions, nafs is used to refer to Allah in the Quran. As, for example, Surah 3, verse 28, "The believers should not make the disbelievers their allies rather than other believers. Anyone who does such a thing will isolate himself completely from God, except when you need to protect yourselves from them. God warned you to beware of him," nafsahu. But this use of nafs to refer to Allah tends to be avoided in the later scholarly writings. On one occasion, the Quran uses nafs to refer to the jinn, to the those spiritual genies, those spiritual beings. Surah 6, verse 130, addressing the jinn and mankind, "Did messengers not come from among you to recite my revelations to you and warn that you would meet this day? They will say, we will testify against ourselves. The life of this world seduced them that they will testify against themselves. Anfusihim, that they rejected the truth." Nafs is not used to refer to angels. And the third term, used fairly infrequently, is rajul, rijal. Again, it has a cognate in Hebrew, regel, raglaim. Rajul, or here rijal, can be used for both men or for jinn. Surah 72, 6. "True, there were persons among mankind who took shelter with persons among the jinns, but they increased them in folly." That's quite an interesting use of the same term for the different kinds of persons, living human persons or spiritual persons. The common denominator. Rajul seems to mean something like legged creatures. Anyway, there's more work to be done there, but that gets us started in terms of the anthropological vocabulary of the Quran. So much for the vocabulary, for the terminology. What about the theology? What about the understanding in the theological writings, in the scholarly writings? What is the Islamic view? Is there an Islamic view? This is something which greatly interests me as a student of Islam down the decades that I've been studying Islam, to listen to different Muslim voices, because really on any key issue of theology and belief, you are going to find different Muslim voices engaging in debate and discussion. And so, what are the different Muslim perspectives? Obviously, Islam is bound together, but it's also quite diverse as well. Islam's not like that, Islam's more like that. There is a unity, but it's a unity of disparate parts. So what are those disparate parts? What's the view how do we hear those different voices? And what I'm doing in my paper is I'm considering really a different kind of approach that different Muslims take. And I'm going to use terms to refer to groups as follows. I'm going to refer to really the champions of revelation. That's my term. There are many other terms to say the same thing. These are really those who approach their text. They read their texts in a literalist kind of way, from page to world. For them, the sort of surface meaning of the sacred text is paramount. They apply a literalist hermeneutic in interpreting the Qur'an. They assert that scripture and legal texts are sufficient in themselves, supplemented by selected scholarly writings. And of course, that's a mindset which has produced some of the more radical revivalist expressions of Islam down through the centuries and in the modern day as well. Over against that, I'm referring to a second group who I'm calling the champions of reason. Their approach to their texts is more based on rational reasoning. They apply a reason-based hermeneutic. They emphasise scripture plus the scholarly writings by rationalist theologians. And I won't spend much time on this in my talk, but they represented a very fascinating expression of Islam in the early centuries of Islam, as the faith was seeking to define itself really. During the formative period, there was a school of theologians called the Mu'tazila, and they were the rationalist theologians who were, in a sense, they were early rationalist, speculative thinkers who were seeking an Islam which they lost the argument back then. They lost out to the literalists. I'll come back to them as we go. So, coming back to my quick. Oh, by the way, I just add that I'm somewhat influenced in this way of thinking by the Wesleyan quadrilateral for the Christian theologians among you. Of course, there is the mystical stream, and I've already asked the two earlier speakers about the mystical stream within Judaism and Christianity. That interests me greatly. I'll have more to say about that later. So, rather than asking what does Islam say about personhood, I think it's better to ask what various perspectives do different Muslims have on personhood. How do we hear the debates around the question of personhood? And I think in terms of focusing on today, the greatest dynamic today is in the engagement between the champions of revelation and the champions of reason. And I'll come back and say more about the mystical stream if time allows. So let's begin with the champions of revelation. Those who, as I say, they take a fairly literalist approach to engaging in exegesis and hermeneutics of their sacred texts. How are they understanding personhood? Well, in the early century of debate, of course in the Christian tradition, there's been an increasing focus on the person as an individual rational being. Now, our Christian speakers may wish to challenge me on that, and we can discuss that. I'm here primarily to talk about Islam, but that would contrast with Islamic orthodoxy, where the debate in the 9th century from the rationalists was largely subverted by the literalists. And that saw the demotion of the person as an individual rational being empowered to determine one's own path in life, and the promotion of the person as a human creature subject to the will of Allah, whose primary function was service. So, coming out of that early debate, the concept of person was very much based on this idea here, the individual person subject to the will of God with a primary function of service. Now, why do I say this? Well, let's look at the materials. Let's begin by looking fairly briefly at the Hadith. This is the second body of sacred literature within the Islamic canon. What comes through very clearly when we look at the Hadith materials is the concept of the person's life, the detail of the human life, being pre-written. So one Hadith account seems to point to a person fulfilling their God-given duties. So 120 days, this is an interesting one, 120 days after a person's conception, Allah writes the person's gender, future material status, age at death, and final abode, paradise or hell. So this is quite foundational. This idea of it being written ahead of time, the supreme sovereignty of God, and the human being having it all mapped out. And this idea of things being pre-written comes through again and again and again in the Hadith materials. And this is what the champions of revelation hold on to. We'll consider an alternative school later. I won't read all the words, but the great collection of Hadith by Al-Bukhari talks about it having been pre-written whom one will marry or whom one will divorce, something that's written ahead of time. So you see that the person is there inheriting, in a sense, what has been pre-written for them by the divine. It's even pre-written, according to the Hadith, how long one will pray for during Friday prayers. Again, we have another quotation there, which will go into my paper. Then the person at the mosque prays as much as Allah has written for him. In some cases, it's pre-written whether one gives to charity. So we have another quote here about it being foreordained. And here's an interesting one relating to the person, to Adam, the story of Adam. Notably, Adam is not to be blamed for his sin, since it was an action which Allah had written in his fate 40 years before his creation. So this is actually grist to the mill of the champions of revelation. And of course it's something that the champions of reason want to approach from a different angle. So let's read this one. The prophet, that's Muhammad, the prophet said, Adam and Moses argued with each other. Moses said to Adam, "O Adam, you are our father who disappointed us and turned us out of paradise." Then Adam said to him, "O Moses, Allah favoured you with his talked to you directly, and he wrote the Torah for you with his own hand. Do you blame me for action which Allah had written in my fate 40 years before my creation?" So Adam confuted Moses, Adam confuted Moses. The prophet added, repeating this statement 3 times. And so this idea of the person having their path, the detail mapped out for them ahead of time, pre-written, it also appears in parts in the Qur'an as well. And here's just one verse from Surah 9, verse 51, which says, "Say, only what God has decreed will happen to us. He is our master. Let the believers put their trust in God." So, if it's pre-written, then the next question, I'm taking the questions one by one. What is the purpose of the creation of humankind? What is the purpose of the person? What's their duty statement, in a sense, I guess? Well, clearly, the person does have a purpose. A verse from the Quran which points to this says that humankind was created for a purpose. Did you think we had created you in vain and that you would not be brought back to us? So, God has created humankind for a particular purpose. And that purpose is unpacked fairly clearly in Surah 51, where the verse has God saying, I have only created jinn and men that they may serve me. This idea of service. No sustenance do I require of them, nor do I require that they should feed me. So these are the texts. What do the scholars make of this? Now remember, we are focusing on the champions of revelation at the moment. Those scholars for whom they take a literalist hermeneutic, they look at the surface reading. So one of my favourite scholars is a famous classical commentator on the Quran, Abu Muhammad al-Hussein ibn Mas'ud ibn Muhammad al-Farah al-Bahawi. He died in the early 12th century. What's his comment on that? On this verse? This verse here. What does he say? Well, he says, "I created jinn and mankind only to worship." That's the verse. And then he cites his scholarly sources. So Kalbi, Bahaq, and Sufyan said, "This is especially for those obedient to him from both groups. Evidenced by the reading of Ibn Abbas, I created jinn and mankind among the believers only to worship." Then he added, "We have hurried into hell many jinn and mankind." So really it's reinforcing that literalist reading of the verse. What about some modern writers? Well, let's consider Gamal al-Banna, Egyptian, famous Egyptian man, brother of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. In his writing, he stresses that man's primary purpose in Islam derives from being the Khalifa, who has to relate to this earth on behalf of God and in accordance with his guidance and values, not just by pursuing personal interest. Here we're getting an interesting word, relate. And in Professor Alam's talk earlier, the question of relationship was very central. So we're getting the word relate appear here. Now, how's that used? Before I answer that, let's look at one more scholarly quotation. I've spent a lot of time in Islamic Southeast Asia and in Indonesia, so I like bringing in Indonesian theologians to my research. And this next one is by an Indonesian theologian, Marwan Hadidi ibn Musa, commenting on the same verse. He says, "This was the purpose of Almighty God in creating jinn and mankind, and he delegated the prophets to summon them in order that they worship him." So that's the idea again. But then he goes on interestingly, involving coming to know him and love him, to return to him and to approach him and turn away from other than him. This depends on knowledge of him. Each time a servant increases in his knowledge, his worship is also perfected. This is why Allah created mankind and jinn, not because he was in need of them. So we get this idea of relationship, but it's a relationship of unquestioning subservience, of unquestioning servanthood. And that would be something interesting to discuss across the papers, actually. So much for the purpose. I'm sort of touching on lily pads here. Let's go on to the nature of the person, the nature of humankind. There's an interesting verse that comes from Surah Yusuf, from the story of Joseph, from that lengthy story that we touched on earlier, where there is a reference to, in Surah 12, verse 53, there's a reference to the soul which commands towards evil. Nafs al-Amara bis-su'. What does that mean, the soul which commands to evil? What does it mean? Well, the Islamic theologian At-Tabari, at the top there, very famous. He was, in a sense, he was one of the greatest early commentators on the Quran. He collected all the exegesis that had happened beforehand and gathered it into this massive multi-volume work. He says, well, there are actually three types of nafs. One is this first one, a soul which commands towards evil, one which drifts towards evil, a soul which drifts towards evil. And one of my favourite commentators, Bavarian, he explains that. He says, the Nafs al-Amara bisu' has Satan as its ally. He promises it great rewards and gains. He casts falsehood into it. He invites it and entices the soul to do evil. He leads it on with hope after hope and presents falsehood to the soul in a form that will accept and admire. So there you have one kind of person, soul, drifting to the bad. The second type is nafsul lawama, the soul that blames. This is the confused soul, the soul that is uncertain. Explained by another very famous classical theologian, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah. He said, it's been said that the nafs al-lawama is the one which cannot rest in any one state. It often changes. It remembers and it forgets. It submits and it evades. It loves and it hates. It rejoices and becomes sad. It accepts and rejects. It obeys and it rebels. I feel like that sometimes myself, I must admit. But it's the soul that is uncertain, that's sort of drifting. Going left, going right, what's it doing? And then the third kind of soul, according to this categorization by the classical theologians, this unpacking the person, is the nafs al-mutma'inna, the soul at peace. It's the soul of the believer, made calm by what Allah has promised. Its owner is at rest and content with his knowledge of Allah's names and attributes, and with what he has said about himself and his messenger, and what he has said about what awaits the soul after death, about the departure of the soul, and so on and so forth. So this is the soul at peace, the soul of the believer. So you see, the nature of the nature of the person is threefold according to this categorization, and this categorization is very much unpacked by the scholar who, in a sense, became the most reputed scholar on the question of the nafs, of the soul, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah. He said, those three souls, they're not separate because the nafs is a single identity. And this would be interesting to think about in a kind of Trinitarian fashion, to be thinking across the papers. The nafs is a single entity, although its state may change. From the nafs al-amara to the nafs al-lawama to the nafs al-mutma'inna, which is the final aim of perfection. So, such is the nature of the soul. And he goes on and he concludes what became orthodoxy, that the nafs was itself a body, different from the physical body of the nature of light. It was created but everlasting. It remains in the grave awaiting the resurrection. Fascinating. So with this, what is the individual believer to do? Because things have been written. Everything's been written. If you follow this champions of reason, champions of revelation mindset, everything's been written. We've understood that the purpose of the creation of humankind is service, to worship, to serve Allah. And there is this threefold nature of self which can drift one way or the other way. What is the person to do? Well, the goal is to accept guidance. This is the teaching of the champions of revelation. In other words, guidance is provided. It's a straight road. Guidance is provided in the form of the law, in the form of where I started, the beliefs, the pillars. There's a quote by a very famous modern exegete, Sayyid Qutb, who fits into this group, I think, comfortably, of being champions of revelation. So you've got a straight path there. Another key factor, I think, here is that if this is mind-bending stuff, and it can be because many Muslims have asked down the centuries, well, if everything's written and if everything's mapped out, How can I be punished for my sins? One theme that comes through quite a lot in some of the writings of this particular school is really don't ask too many questions. Ibn Taymiyyah, famous classical medieval writer, 14th century, he said man's purpose is not to know but to obey him. There's a doctrine in Islam, bila kayfa, without how, literally means. In other words, don't ask. It's, accept what is beyond human comprehension, because human comprehension is limited. So accept. Maududi, a 20th century scholar, says the sphere of human perceptions as against the vastness of this great universe is not even comparable to a drop of water as against the ocean. And here's a good quote from a Southeast Asian scholar. As I say, I like to bring in the Southeast Asians, Dolby Fatani. He says, it's not required to discuss the attributes of God and their relations, whether they are the essence or not. In fact, the companions of the Prophet and their followers themselves abstain from addressing such issues. So this, in a sense, is safe silence. Indeed, they forbade discussion of them. It's better and much safer for us not to discuss something which is beyond our intellectual ability. How does this relate to the issue of silence, which was fascinating that you brought up earlier, sir? That's a conversation to be had, I guess. And to sum it all up, from the champions of revelation, and I'm spending more time on them than the others, to sum it all up, it comes down to this, I think. We're talking about instrumental servanthood, not agentive personhood. So when we discuss human personhood, do we start with human beings or with God? Well, the champions of revelation, this group I'm focusing on now, they would respond, this is not the right question to ask. Rather, they would affirm the key issue is not personhood, but servanthood. In the Islamic scheme of things, according to the champions of revelation, the human is an instrument. The person is an instrument to fulfill God's purposes, not an agent to fulfill human purposes. So where does that leave us with regard to sin? Well, there's no original sin, leaving a legacy for succeeding generations of a broken relationship between God and man, as we might express in a Christian context. Therefore, there's no need for the kind of bridge between God and the human sinner provided by a personal saviour. All that's needed is a mechanism in the form of scripture and law which acts as a blueprint to guide humans to follow God's instructions and thereby to earn his favour on the day of judgment. Something else that would be interesting to discuss earlier with regard to your Judaism paper was the eternity of the human species going on. And that I heard some significant differences there with Islam. Perhaps we could discuss that. God is not a person. God is eternal without beginning or end. The soul of the created person is not eternal. Souls were created so they have a beginning. And so to use terms, scholars would avoid using terms for humans that referred to, also using them to refer to God, it would verge on blasphemy. Let me go on to the champions of reason, the views of the champions of reason. How are they different? How do we hear something different from this group with regard to the human person? Well, it's interesting because from some of the writers and the thinkers from this school, the sort of rationalists, speculative theologians, a very early one was Al-Hasan al-Basri. He wrote, God ordered them to worship him, which is why he created them. But he also argued very much in favour of free will, so that for the human being, there's not just a single road which goes down the middle, but the person stands at the crossroads having to make a decision which way to go. And this school accords the human being the right, the sort of freedom to be making those choices and to suffer the consequences as a result. Now, this is not, when you look at Islamic history, I would argue that this is, what I'm expressing now, is not the mainstream view down through the centuries, but it's a view which was very strongly held in the early centuries of Islam, has never gone away completely, and has made quite a comeback in the 20th century. Why was humankind created, according to this school? Well, an early thinker, one of the Mu'tazilite thinkers, those early rationalist theologians, he commented on the famous verse 51:56. He said, the verse says, "I created jinn and mankind only to worship me." Zamakhshari, the scholar, he writes, "I created jinn and mankind only for the sake of worship, and I did not wish anything from them except that." But he goes on, "And if I said it was a wish that worship would come from them, then would they all be worshippers? I said truly I wanted them to worship by choice, not by obligation, because they were created with possibilities. Some chose to leave worship as was their wish, and if I wished for coercion, salvation would have embraced them all." In this group of theologians, we're starting to get some interesting developments of the idea of relationship. So let me quote an Indonesian scholar, Jalaluddin Harahmat. He comments as follows. He says, "All Muslims feel that Islam is not just about regulating the relationship between mankind and God. All groups agree, both fundamentalists and liberals, well, that's debatable, but anyway, that in our religion there must be a relationship between the individual and God, but one must still be cognizant that one is part of a society. What then becomes a challenge is to formulate our position in the midst of that society." Interesting, it's starting to take the shape of a triangle: God, individual, community. So the idea of relationship is being teased out by this school. And on the question of, staying on the question of the purpose, Mahmoud Abu Saud, a member who I would argue is a member of this Champions of Reason, he says God's purposes in creating man is to worship, yes, to worship, but beyond that, he's more expansive, to represent God in the guardianship over the creation. So he's actually been delegated some responsibilities, and to cause growth on earth and make it more resourceful for his own benefit, welfare and prosperity. We're starting to hear a more expansive approach. What about sin, original sin? Now at this point, the two schools, I would argue, come together, because the rationalist-minded theologians, they also have a problem with original sin. And I think Muslim schools from the different streams that I have observed are fairly unanimous in rejecting the concept of original sin. It's something on which they agree. What time did I start? Did anybody notice?
20 minutes.
So, how long have I been speaking?
10 minutes.
10 minutes more?
Mm.
Okay. Let me say something briefly about the Sufis. We can talk about this a little more. Sufi, I find the whole mystical tradition of Islam quite fascinating, because Sufis latch onto particular verses of the Qur'an which offer possibilities for mystical reflection which are not offered by some other verses. This is one of their favourite verses, of course. So in this verse, the concept of dualism and distance is somewhat collapsed. So the dualistic God up there and the creature down here is somewhat collapsed into, brought much closer. This verse, God is the light of the heavens and the earth. His light is like this. There is a niche In it a lamp, the lamp inside a glass like a glittering star, fuel from a blessed olive tree, from neither east nor west, whose oil almost gives light even when no fire touches it. Light upon light, God guides whoever he will to his light. God draws such comparisons for people. God has full knowledge of everything. And in the next slide, I've got a couple of quotes from one of my favourite Sufi writers, Southeast Asian Hamza Fansuri. Just listen to what he says. Listen to this idea. He says in some of his poetry, he says, when you know your inner self, its beauty is without compare. Servant and Lord, servant, human, Lord, God, are eternally one. Of neglecting the self you should beware. So in other words, what this Sufi is doing, and many schools of Sufism, is that they are bringing the distance between the eternal, the creator up there and the creature down here into oneness. And that, of course, in a sense, it affirms the overriding sovereignty of the one God, if it's all one. Because if all is God, then the human free will, championed by the early rationalists, becomes a non-issue. God directs all, as seen in the following citation from Hamza's prose. Let's listen to this. Same writer, he says, one he causes to disbelieve. So you see, we can hear still this massive sovereignty, this sovereign control of the oneness. One he causes to disbelieve, one he causes to believe, one he causes to disbelieve. One he causes to be rich, one he causes to be poor. One he allows always to transgress, one he allows always to do good. One he allows to do evil, one he causes to enter heaven, one he causes to enter hell. So in a sense, that choice for the person of the two roads going either way has been taken away, because the sovereignty of God has been reaffirmed. There's more work to do on the Sufi side. Perhaps we can discuss that further if you like. Just to wrap up now, the final question I'm asking in my paper is, okay, all that, interesting enough, how does that speak into issues today? Some of the contemporary debates, issues of current discussion. How do the different schools inform the current discussion? For example, question of contraception. You know, these are daily questions that affect the Muslim world like they affect non-Muslim societies as well. Contraception is all about prevention of a person. This relates to the concept of personhood. And on this, the two groups, the champions of revelation and champions of reason, tend to agree. They're very close because, as one writer says, where pregnancy may injure the health of the woman or may even threaten her life, the higher purpose of protecting life would prevail, requiring a woman to make use of contraceptive devices to protect her health or life. The use of contraceptive devices for other reasons by mutual consent between the husband and wife is undesirable, but not necessarily forbidden under the law. What about another hot topic, abortion? Again, abortion is much debated in Muslim majority societies as it is debated in non-Muslim majority societies. There's some debate between the schools on this, but it's not that acute. Because the Quran and some hadith references seem to suggest that this 120-day limit, that the fetus develops in the womb according to 3 stages during the first 119 days, and then on the 120th day, ensoulment takes place. So before the 120th day, you have this process of fetal development, but there's not yet the nafs, there's not yet a soul there. So you see the person issue is relevant to the person issue. And so once the 120 days is hit, after that, the presence of a soul makes abortion unacceptable. But up until 120 days, abortion is acceptable. So that tends to be the standard position. Where there is a debate in this area is that there is some debate about whether it's 120 days or some other period of time. Two more, I'm doing this fairly briefly, two more hot topics of today: the question of cloning, the artificial creation of a person. How do Muslims view this? Well, here you do get differences in the schools. You get a very strong conservative reaction against cloning from the champions of revelation, and I've just given you one example here. This is from a fatwa. I've been online looking at fatwas issued by different groups. And this group, called the Council of Alims in Dagestan, says, does Islam allow cloning? Islam prohibits cloning. When a man wishes to recreate the Lord's creation, he aspires to play the part of the creator. The fact that it is forbidden is proved by one of the hadith: who is more wrong than he who tries to create like Allah creates. But some more liberal Islamic theologians from champions of reason, such as this gentleman here, Abdulaziz Sahidina, he says the facts about cloning are just now emerging. In the light of better understanding of the facts regarding cloning, both through embryo splitting as well as nuclear transplantation, and the impact it could have upon the way Muslims conceive of human life and its purposes, it's reasonable to expect revisions of the ethical and legal assessment of these experiments among the scholars of Sharia. So the artificial creation of a person is up for grabs. Muslim scholars are debating that at the moment. And the final hot topic, and this is an uncomfortable one, it's this concept of transformation, what I'm calling depersonalization, transformation to monkey and pig. Now, this is found in some verses of the text, in the Qur'an and the Hadith, that suggest that at various points in the past, God's punishment for various violations includes transforming the transgressors into monkeys and pigs. For example, Surah 5, verse 60, those who incurred the curse of Allah and his wrath, those of whom some he transformed into apes and swine. And this theme is reinforced within the Hadith, the second most authoritative component of Islamic sacred texts. Now that's a completely different angle on the whole question of person, that a person can be depersonalised in terms of a human person. And that needs more attention. It is regularly part of the discourse of more radical Islamic groups. Other groups struggle with it because there are references in the Quran. So that is a topic about which there needs to be more discussion. I've covered a lot of ground there. As I say, there's more to cover. My paper at this stage is sitting at 10,000 words, so there's far more than I was able to present, but that will do for now.
Thank you very much.